So for the benefit of those that are joining us for the first time, I will just briefly say some few words about who we are and what we are about and why this platform is very important for us. So the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, ACCPA, is a Sino-Africa focused, as our name show, policy research think tank, which is headquartered here in Accra, Ghana. We have a team in DRC, in Tanzania, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Botswana, and now Ethiopia as well. So we are truly an African-focused, Africa-China focused think tank. Of course, China is a constant country, but for us, it's all 54 countries on the continent. Our work is cut out for us, basically. We just in here to be involved in the knowledge production when it comes to the African perspective in terms of our relation with China. And so we're involved in putting together some of these platforms to engage more on Africa-China relations. Again, we're also involved in creating platforms for engagement, for dialogues, for various conversations that, revolves around Africa-China, just like we're doing now between this conversation that we are having. So we want to welcome all of you. I mean, if you are joining us here and you are interested in the kind of work we are doing and you are looking to partner with the ACCPA, our doors are very much open. We're more than welcome you to actually reach out in the course of the conversation. I will put there my email address and, of course, our website, which I'm sure all of you that have joined this meeting might have seen. But I'll put my email address there so you can actually look at it and then join us and send us an email if you're looking to partner with what we're doing, interested in any kind of research projects or in terms of policy-wise. And we work with both government and private sector players as well. So irrespective of where you are, whether in the public or private sector, we are more than happy to welcome you to actually join us as a partner. So today we are very much privileged and happy to have gotten all of you to join us. And most importantly, we have some distinguished speakers that have joined us for today's session. So for ACCPA, this is an opening discussion that we are having, trying to, in as much as there are a lot of issues that we can look at in terms of what could happen or unfold in the Sino-Africa relation in 2024, we're trying to pick on some specific issues that we think are going to be very instrumental in terms of what is going to unfold in 2024 between Africa and China. And to help us delve into that, before I even give a brief about what the topic is, we're very much privileged to have some distinguished speakers that have joined us today. And I'll briefly introduce our speakers for the sessions, for the session that we have. So first, of course, we have our very own, my friend Nancy Lohalo, who is a senior research fellow of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. She spent over a decade in China, where she completed her education. She has a PhD in economics from the University of International Business and Economics. She's an economist, she's a consultant, and a professor at ISP Gombe. Now she's been helping with the advisory role at the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo since she returned back from her studies in China. Her areas of research expertise lie at the intersection of international economics and the digital economy, with particular attention on women's economic empowerment and international development. So, Nancy, if you can say hi so they know who you are, and just say hi.
Hello, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you for that introduction.
Yeah, great. So we also have a very distinguished individual as well. We have Professor David Monyai. He is the director for Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Monyai is an international relations and foreign policy expert with PhD in international relations from the University of Witwatersrand, which is in South Africa. He previously served as section manager, international relations policy analysis at the South African Parliament, providing strategic management, parliamentary foreign policy formulation, and monitoring analysis services. He has published widely and is respected political analyst, featuring in national and international media. I think he recently published a book on regional integration. I had the privilege of getting a copy and a signed copy while also with him in Beijing recently for the BRI Forum. So we have Professor David Monya joining us as well. Prof, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm with, I think I can see on those who have joined, Dr. Season Gala, my co-editor on that particular book.
Okay, that's good. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that beautiful gift. Yes, it's already in our library here. So we also have our very friend as well, 𝐾𝐤𝐞𝐫𝐞𝐫𝐞𝐫𝐿. She is a China-Africa doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. She is completing a PhD in politics at the University of Oxford. Her work focuses on climate change in the Sino-African relation. I believe this is a very profound niche, looking at what is happening in our world today. She has a master's in contemporary Chinese studies from the University of Oxford. Her thesis research analyzed African perception of Chinese economic diplomacy, with a focus on the activities of China's civil engineering construction corporation in Nigeria. She studied at Tsinghua University in China as a 𝐏𝐫𝐨𝐼𝐻 scholar. So actually, just when I posted about your profile online, I got a lot of feedback from people who really wanted to know more from, want to hear from you as a 𝐏𝐫𝐶 scholar, actually. So that's very interesting to have you, Fikayo, join us. And actually, she has worked, in various roles, in fact, working with Bloomberg and other international development organization. And she received a master's in global affairs from the Tsinghua, from the 𝐏𝐫𝐶 scholar program, with a capstone project where she focused on how Chinese firms like Huawei operate in Africa, primarily as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are our panelists for today's webinar. And briefly about the webinar, so what we're trying to do is to just, in a very short space of time, try to get various perspectives on what will unfold in Africa-China relations in 2024. I think it's going to be a very busy year for Sino-Africa relations, because it is going to be the 9th FOCAC Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing. And that means that the whole year we're going to be seeing a lot of discussion, interaction across various spectrums on what is happening between Africa and China. There's still going to be BRICS, which is now going to be hosted. Last year was in Africa. This year, I think, going to be Russia, I think, if I'm correct. So it's going to be Russia hosting the BRICS, among many other things that are expected to unfold in 2024. So to help us delve deeper into some of these issues, we're going to touch on FOCAC, on the debt sustainability issues. We're going to talk about climate change and, of course, digital innovation, conversation as well in terms of what's happening between Africa and China in that regard. So this is how the format is going to be. So each of our speakers is going to get 7 to 10 minutes to give a brief thoughts about the issue that we've raised. And thereafter, of course, I also come with some questions to them based on their area of expertise. And then you that have joined us, you also have the chance to send your questions. So if you're familiar with the Zoom platform, there's a Q&A button that's on your Zoom app. So if you have any questions regarding the issues that we are going to discuss, please put the question through via the Q&A button. I'll read it out to our speakers. If you want to mention direct name to the speaker that you want to address the question to, you can do so as well. And that speaker will address the question. We are hoping to be done and out of here in under 60 minutes. So to kick us, starting this conversation, I'll invite my very own Nancy Lohalo, who is a senior research fellow at the ACCPA. She's going to touch briefly about innovation, technology, and digitalization. What are we supposed to look out for in Africa and China relations in terms of that area? So Nancy, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So today I will be discussing Africa and China in 2024, and especially from the technology, innovation, digitalization, and FOCAC perspective. I will start first with Africa's technological and digital commitment. Then I will continue with FOCAC and the key trends in Africa-China digital cooperation. then the bottlenecks in Africa and China digital cooperation, and the future of cooperation and recommendations, and some recommendations. So starting with Africa's commitment to digital economy, to digitalization, this is something that I like to go back often to explain more on why digitalization is extremely important today, and why African countries, they are now realizing that development cannot be achieved without the digital component. If we look, maybe it's because I'm an economist that I would like to go back to that prediction process, the prediction process. But in the economy, to make it simple, when we go into more traditional agricultural economy, for instance, we are using some inputs such as labor force, land, and technological progress to produce, to have some output. But if we are transitioning to a digital economy, as we are transitioning, we are passing by industrial economy, we are adding a new component, which is capital. And then when we are moving to the digital economy, we are adding a new component this time, which is data. And data is not only a component that we are adding in the production processes, but it's a component that is also affecting all the other factors, that is affecting labor, that is affecting the capital, that is affecting land, etc. So because of this now today, as I mentioned before, development is unachievable in this economy as nations are shifting towards internet-based economy. And African countries are realizing this, and we have seen it in the Agenda 2063, which is the blueprint for transforming Africa, that now digitalization is becoming also a priority. We have seen that there are strategies that are being implemented to have a stronger digital economy, to have digital infrastructure, to have strong broadband, and to have access for all of the Africans, access to internet for all Africans. Today, we only approximately 30% of African people have access to internet. They are missing, and they cannot leverage or reap the fruits from what the digital world can bring to the development. So as I've mentioned, now we have seen that an increasing number of African countries are realizing that it is imperative for them to shift more and more toward an economy that is based on digitalization, digital technologies. And they have now taken further steps by either adopting the digital agendas in the national development plans, or they have separate digital strategies plans as well, or they have disparate, whether it is initiatives or documents, but they are taking steps towards that. This map dates back in 2021. There have been some progress made in a few countries, such for instance as Libya, that didn't have any digital agendas, but now they are taking steps, and they have the plans to, for instance, provide digital services to the population. So we have seen that it's an imperative in the development strategy of African countries. Now looking at FOCAC and the difference in Africa and China cooperation. Starting with FOCAC. FOCAC, we all know that it is a reference and a reference in China and Africa relations when it comes to programs that will be that will generate from them initiatives, from the forum initiatives, and so on. In the last action plan, the Dakar action plan, there was a specific segment that was allocated for digital in the digital economy in the corporation to actually deepen and more, not deepen the cooperation, but to put an emphasis on their technological cooperation, if I may say. I will not go look at all of the different actions that were mentioned here, but we have seen that, for instance, on the point 3.7.2, that there was plans to formulate and implement the China-Africa Digital Innovation Partnership Program. That there were also plans to for China to take 10 digital economy assistance projects for Africa. And to be perfectly honest, and this is something that I will mention afterwards, it remains quite challenging to actually track the progress that are being made in that specific regard. And that is also a problem that I had mentioned. That is, there is a lack of data that is produced from the African side that can help us also progress the implementation of the different initiatives or the different actions that are formulated, for instance, in forums such as FOCAC. So, for instance, the China-Africa Digital Innovation Partnership Program hasn't been implemented as we speak. It's only on paper for now. So this is something that we'll discuss later on the bottleneck. Looking also at some other actions, we can see that China will work with Africa to improve technology transfer. So now we are also pushing more and more into the technological transfer that will also serve to build more capacity within Africa. And also to have now enhanced cooperation in international organizations such as ITU. And we know that traditionally African countries, they didn't have that much of a big voices in this organization, and especially when it came to technological decisions or digitalization and so on. So now it's you can say that they're finding support in China as well. So this is not in the digital sphere, but I think this is something that is also important to mention, given that it's still a part of the Dakar Action Plan, and it's something that came to realization in July of 2023, which was the opening of the China Cooperation Center on Satellite Remote and Sensing Application. So things are actually being made, even though there are bottlenecks along the way. So I think the most important is to find the better strategies that I will discuss afterward. Since we are talking about the key trends, it's important to be aware that China digital influence in Africa started in telecommunications in the 1990s, where the sector was liberalized. And we had firms such as Huawei or ZTE that came and started to develop key infrastructure. So it makes more sense also for them to be partners to develop to enhance digital transformation in Africa. And we also have the Digital Silk Road, which was officially introduced as a third component in 2015 as the Belt and Road of the Belt and Road initiatives. And this Digital Silk Road also aims to to support Africa in 5 key areas, which is not only strengthen connectivity among people, which is one of the vendor initiative mantra, but it also to accelerate digital transformation, to strengthen policy alignment, and to enhance exchange and cooperation. And now looking at the bottlenecks in Africa and China digital cooperation. So before going to the bottleneck directly, Africa has already expressed its priorities when it comes to digitalization, digital cooperation, digital transformation. And the first priority, of course, is the digital infrastructure development, which remains crucial for digitalization to spread across the country. There are also in second phase digital skills and affordability of digital services. So now some of the key bottlenecks. First, there is a lack of coordination with digital agendas. When there are initiatives that are mentioned, or when there are actions that have been mentioned, such as in FOCAC, there is a lack of coordination from the African side, I would say, because we know our priorities. So we need to be more, to find ways to be more coordinated and put the priorities really on the table. There are also challenges in targeting countries and areas of interventions. Still looking at the FOCAC, this is a very general, the very general actions and the initiatives that are taken for the whole Africa. But Africa is not a country. There are different countries, there are many countries in Africa. So how do we select the countries? How do we select the area of intervention that remain also a challenge that can also slow down progress? And there is a lack of data that I had mentioned before, lack of data that is also produced from the African side to track the progress in China and Africa cooperation in digitalization, for instance. It's difficult to know what has been implemented, or it's also difficult to know, really to identify the key issues if you don't really have data. And you do have delays in deliveries from mechanisms such as funds. Now the future cooperation and recommendations. So what should be different for Africa and China digital cooperation in 2024? To make it quicker, first, we need to take initiatives to better coordinate decisions that are issued in the FOCAC action plans. So the reason the African Union Commission is a FOCAC member, so that could be a starting point. And China has a permanent mission in the African Union. So this also can be those can be both starting points where we can better coordinate all the decisions that are being taken in the forum. The second front will be African countries to collect data to track progress on the implementation of programs or initiatives and to produce more data to guide decisions. Also now to prioritize a multilateral approach to program implementation for greater impact, because we have seen that we have often bilateral approaches when it comes to this type of implementing programs. And now for African countries to better coordinate areas of integration based on whether it is existing strategies or digital agenda. Thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't go over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was brief, but contained a lot of insights from giving us a bit of background on the journey so far, and of course, ending it up with some recommendation on what could happen. We hope that you can remain with us for some few minutes. I understand you said you have a national assignment. So if you can, that's fantastic. If not, whatever question that directed to you, I will take them, send it to you via email. You have to answer them, and I'll send it back to the person who raised those questions. So thank you very much, Nancy, for giving us the overview about what is happening between Africa and China when it comes to innovation, technology, and digitalization, as well as linking into some of the key pillars that has unfolded, especially coming from FOCAC between Africa and China when you made reference to the Dakar action plan. Our next speaker is Professor David Monyai. He's going to give us more like a broader perspective on the Sino-Africa relations. Last year, South Africa, his country, hosted the BRICS. I'm sure he was very much busily involved and looking at what's happening around our world today, the kind of scrutiny that the Africa-China relations is getting. It's going to be a busy year, as I said earlier, with the FOCAC. So, Prof, please, you have the floor to give us your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank you and your organization for inviting me. And I would like to wish you all the best for 2024. And greetings to all those who have joined. I see lots and lots of good friends online. I think perhaps what I'll do is to, given the limitation of time, I'll sum up what I think are the core issues to look at. When we talk about Africa, China, and I really like the center's emphasis on starting with Africa for us to avoid this notion of China, Africa. We need to define ourselves first, and therefore Africa, China, including our own center, we start by defining ourselves. So it is quite important for us to understand and put the relationship into context. I think much has been said and known, but at this particular juncture, I think we have to understand Africa, China within the geopolitics, the question of innovation, the climate change, as well as the so-called debt trap. And I think I'll explain more what do I mean by so-called debt trap. First, to put things into perspective, the relationship between our continent and China has indeed been evolving. The early phase that we all know was that since 1949, and Africa that we know as in 1963 with the formation of the 𝐁 much of the formal relationship was much more in a Cold War in which United States and the then Soviet Union were the core superpowers. And that relationship was much more in the trenches, assisting China, assisting Africa, as well as Africa assisting China on a number of areas at a global level. Post the Cold War era, the era that we are in, I think the relationship has shifted. It's more politics, more economics, and the positioning of China globally has changed. This is no longer the Chairman Mao's China, even though his ideas still informs the current leadership. It's a China that is number 2 globally as an economic power. It's a China that is more assertive, and that comes with the response of the Western world led by the United States, and the tension between the two since the Donald Trump administration. And therefore, Africa remains, sadly, stuck at the bottom of these world politics. And while China has moved the ranks. I think it's important for us to clear that first. And the relationship is good, is in good state. However, China appears as one country with the CPC at the core of it and President Xi Jinping. But on the other hand, we also have Africa that is 53, 54 countries, quite fragmented, operating at the AU level. And whatever we say, the kind of vision we have, Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want, it cannot be compared to China's vision, China's policies, whether it is Belt and Road Initiative and all others. They are much more well articulated, being implemented, and you see the strength and weaknesses of these policies in China, while in Africa it's open-ended, and policies does not take place at AU. At AU level, it's head of states, and they do a lot of talking, feel good, but policy is implemented at a state level. And regional economic communities, which are also, there's quite a bit noisy in terms of how we operate and our approach and our relationship with China. And China is not the only core country that we look at. I think when you look at the AU strategic document, we have strategic partners, the United States, your Britain, your Germany, Japan, and quite a number, South Korea, the Gulf states, your EU, ASEAN, and they're endless. However, I think it is important to note that China appears to be the most powerful among these strategic partners that Africa has. And therefore, there is a competition between the Western world and China within a geopolitics setting. And there are pros and cons in terms of, while on the other hand, Africa remains an important player for China. As a matter of fact, I think Africa appears to be the core of China's foreign policy. You see with, on an annual basis, foreign minister, and as we speak, he is in Africa, Chinese foreign minister. It shows the serious nature of how China looks at Africa. Africa as well, there are a lot of visits to China, and therefore, from that perspective, the relationship remains much, much stronger. The second part that shows the strength of the relationship is that since 2000, China has strengthened its investment in Africa, and by doing so, positively, I think, has invited a number of other investors. And this took place at a time when major investors in the world were looking at Africa in a negative way and were not interested in coming and invest in Africa. And I think we always have to be quite aware that China's massive investment in infrastructure and all other areas, including digital, has indeed, on one hand, shocked, brought fear to others, and while bringing advantage to so many other players and bringing in, which is good news for Africa, more investors in terms of competition, something that otherwise wouldn't have taken place without China massive movement. It would have taken place, but not at the rate in which it is indeed taking place. So what are the core issues? I think our best way of looking at the relationship between Africa and China is to concentrate more on areas of convergence, that there are so many areas of convergence where China's interests and Africa's interests somehow converge. What are those areas? China sees itself as a developing country, at the annoyance of the Western world that does not want to see China in that way. It has uplifted more than 800 million people out of poverty, while Africa, on the other hand, it is the poorest in the world in terms of numbers. And if we look at SDGs, and therefore there's no question that China becomes an important player to Africa, seeing how it has really came from, at some point in the 70s and early 80s, China was much, much poorer than most African countries. And therefore, there are a lot of lessons for the African continent in looking at China in that way. For China, China wants to be a developed, a more powerful power by 2049. 2049, it will be a centenary since 1949. And to do so, I think China is quite aware that it cannot rise alone, whether it likes it or not. There's so much attention by global players, particularly hegemonic powers in the West. And if China tries to do this on its own, it will be overwhelmed. And therefore, I think China, in a very smart way, in recent decades and recent years, we have seen a China that is increasingly playing into the fold of the global South, playing more on Africa, and really try to rise from the disadvantaged former so-called third world countries. Somehow, the wise part of this strategy is that it will be difficult if it stands alone. I think if China standing, for the lack of a better term, in the crowd, it's much better for it to, one, defend itself, legitimacy, and a number of other factors. Beyond that, I think there's also China requiring the assistance and help, given that Africa is rich in terms of its human capital, in terms of its resources, and much of what China needs sits right here in Africa. It's much more easier in terms of its tackling the developed world if it comes through the African continent. So I think there we see these convergences, Belt and Road Initiative, the Africa that we want, Agenda 2063, the Cape to Cairo rail. And I think China was able to see those advantages and try to really get to Africa, Latin America, Europe itself. It becomes much more easy if you go through the African continent. There are a number of other advantages that China has. It has developed quite extensively in a short period of time. Its human capital is at a higher level since the 1978 opening up. So when it comes to innovation, that we have seen one of the few, if not the only country that has, since 1945, challenged the hegemonic United States in terms of technology, and the entire Western world. We see a China that is going to space. It's really controlling the sea. It is powerful when it comes to digital. It's extremely powerful in a number of areas. Not ahead of United States, but really bordering on, really, and knocking some of these countries in certain areas. This is happening at a time when the African continent is unable to do the same. And therefore, what we see is that with the tension at a geopolitics level, the uneasiness of the Western world to have a leading China, we see these politics being played on the African continent, more so than any other place, trying to take out Huawei out of the African continent. This is happening in a negative way and positive way. I think we need to be quite clear that it is bringing more your Amazon and quite a number of other giants in the Western world that otherwise wouldn't have come on the African continent. And we see them opening their offices in Cape Town, and more are coming in a stampede of some sort. I think there's that fear. And we also seen Starlink, for instance, Elon Musk, born in South Africa, Canadian and American at the same time, with his Starlink. But we see that the Chinese are working on their own Starlink. So I think what is happening is that these battles for space of first mover advantage between United States and China has a huge implication on the African continent, a negative as well as a positive. The negative is much more in the sense that Africa, with lots of Africans who are ahead in the technology know-how, yet they're not here on the continent. Most of these technologies, Africans are in the forefront of making breakthroughs. But the continent remains a dormitory where all these countries, any African that makes a breakthrough on technology, that immigrate to the Western world, and therefore depriving the continent of that know-how, lack of stability, lack of organization, even understanding of what's really happening when it comes to data sovereignty, when it comes to e-commerce, and a number of things that are happening. Some of our leaders tend not to think through some of this, how complex some of these things are in terms of our day-to-day politics. And therefore, I think there is a danger that Africa will be left behind as the world enters the fourth industrial revolution. And China is right in the forefront. So the sad part is that there's so much talk at the AU, at the level of regional economic communities, but tangibly, only yesterday or so, we read with shock that in East Africa, the Kenya Airway and Tanzanian Airways, there's a clash between the two. We're talking at the time of regional integration, which should be way ahead. The Kenyans have blocked the Tanzanian to come in, and in return, the Tanzanian has stopped Kenyan Airways, and they're trying to resolve this crisis. But this speaks to the challenges we have of fragmentation while we're talking of movement at the same time. So we have this disadvantage of operating these tiny units, which we call nation states. And I do not think if we continue operating the way we do, will make any impact. I think we need to open these borders. We need to really work as Africans, 1.3 billion people, in a much more unified way. The other areas, just to give example and conclude, even though I have more to say.
We'll come back to you so that you mention.
And then is the infrastructure battles that are taking place. I think we've seen the United States responding to China, Belt and Road, and the whole Mombasa, Kenya, and East Africa, Ethiopia into Djibouti and other areas, and the advantage that China is having even in Nigeria and West Africa in terms of major infrastructure development. We see the United States coming in speedily, and recently the Angolan president was in White House. One of the major issue, which is a contradiction, is that the United States also wants to play the Belt and Road, its own Belt and Road, with all sorts of names that are changing on a monthly basis. There is a belt that the United States wants to build from Zambia into the DRC and then Angola. And that Lobito corridor, it moves and really snake through, meandering into all mining sectors, both in Zambia and the DRC and Angola, way out of Africa. And a lot of questions that we need to ask, as much as we are hard on China and some, the same game is played by the United States, that this belt, it's after minerals, nothing else. I mean, does it speak to regional integration at the continental level? Does it speak to the Mombasa, Nairobi, the China belt on the African continent, or the Africa's own belt? So these are questions that we as researchers, as Africans, need to ask, so that we don't reproduce the colonial patterns where the rail standards are different. The Americans, the Chinese, the British, everyone will just come in, as the case in Djibouti with the military bases. They just walk on the continent willy-nilly, with no control, no management, and no standards laid by Africans. And I think we need to look at the impact of all this infrastructure that are being built, and the lessons of Zambia in terms of so-called debt trap. We were told that the Chinese are the ones who are indebting Africans. But the more excitement of HH in Zambia, and what we see now, is that the Chinese played a smarter game, said we want to renegotiate the debt, but we want everyone else to play the game. And the negotiations have collapsed. We've realized that the Western lenders are refusing to do what the Westerners are demanding China to do in terms of renegotiating these loans. So I think there's so much lessons. We need to learn to negotiate, not just with the Chinese, but with everyone who comes on the African continent. We need to build skills so that we coordinate our activities as we engage external actors. So on that note, I'll pause here.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think you've done justice by giving us more broader perspective on various issues. As you started by saying, what we saw happening, the first phase of Sino-African relations, prior to even the formation of the AU, and then post-AU, what has been happening, of course, first started as a shock and fear, and now the presence of China actually showed the potential of the African continent, and therefore we've seen a number of investments and number of interests from around the world. Thank you very much, Prof. And the areas that you mentioned about convergence, where we have to really look at, and of course, regional integration is a very key part of what or how we should operate as a continent in terms of relation. I'm sure not just with China, but with every other development partner that is very much interested in the African continent. A number of questions have come for you, but I think we'll wait until when we're done with our third speaker, 𝐏𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐿. So 𝐏𝐤𝐤𝐤 is a climate change expert that we have here today. So she's going to be more directly specific on climate change and what has been happening in terms of Africa-China cooperation when it comes to climate change, what has been Africa's own response to climate change, what has been the case from China's perspective in the FOCAC pillars, what has been some of the key commitments and how far has those commitments been materialized, and some of the challenges that is happening in terms of Africa-China relation when it comes to climate change. So 𝐏𝐤𝐤𝐤, please, you have the floor to share with us your first few remarks.
Yes. Can everyone hear me? I hope you can.
Yes, we can hear you and see clearly.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so again, thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for doing this. It's always good to sort of start the year with these kinds of conversations to ground us in what's happening. So my work focuses mainly on the China-Africa relationship and then climate change. And one of the things that comes up when you're working in the climate change space is you realize climate change is sort of the symptom, right? The disease itself, there's so many other factors that are causing the disease, if that makes sense, right? Like climate change as an issue does not exist alone. There are several things causing it. So what I thought would be helpful is to do a recap of what people in the climate change space were talking about in 2023, and then talk about what people going into 2024 in the climate change space, what we're looking at as it relates to the China-Africa relationship. And I didn't prepare slides, but I've sort of written this down. It's on my LinkedIn. You're welcome to sort of look at it, and I can share a link after. But there's sort of 5 key issues that coming out of 2023 were most important to people in the China-Africa climate change space. One is the BRI turned 10 last year. Right. And, the BRI, for all its criticisms and all the things that have been said about the BRI turning 10 was a very pivotal moment, because what we see is a move from, historically, China was funding big infrastructure projects, right? Like building roads, building railways, building dams. The BRI turning 10, you saw a move from these massive infrastructure projects that didn't account for climate change to small is beautiful, 𝐏𝐤𝐤𝐿, it's small is beautiful. So there's sort of that focus into smaller projects that are beautiful and environmentally conscious. So that's one. The BRI turning 10 was a major thing that happened last year that was, really significant for the China-Africa relationship. The second thing, and a lot of my work, I try to center African agency. I'm one of those people who I get very annoyed when people say things like, oh, China is doing this in Africa. It's like, well, that removes agency as a factor. So my work also sort of centers the African agency piece. And one other thing that, happened specifically for Africa last year that was very important is Africa's voting patterns at the United Nations, right? So you saw as the Israel-Hamas crisis broke out, there was a split in how African countries were voting around at the United Nations for that, right? Like certain countries voted for a ceasefire, certain countries did not vote for a ceasefire. But why that was very important from a climate perspective and from a sort of Africa globally perspective is African countries are no longer a monolith, right? Like historically at the UN, the Africans, and the expectation was everybody in Africa just, we just go ahead with each other. But what you immediately saw is that Africa as a group is starting to have its own internal divisions show on the global stage. And more importantly, Africa is standing up, if that makes sense, right? I don't know how many of you are active on Twitter, but with this Israel-Hamas thing going on, the Namibian government has released a statement accusing Germany of the original genocide, right? So what happens coming out of 2023 is you start to see African countries really stepping up to the international stage in a way that maybe has not happened historically before. And, again, that's sort of going to feed into 2024 as we discuss loss and damage and some of these other things. So that's 2. The first one, BRI turned 10. 2 is Africa at the UN. The third thing, which I think I spent all of this time last year working on, are the debt conversations. Now, there's data that shows that countries that have a high debt burden are more likely to suffer negatively from climate change. I mean, everybody suffers negatively, but the higher your debt burden, the more at risk you are of climate change. Now, the most debt burdened countries in the world are African countries. As of last year, the IMF considered 22 low-income African countries to be in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And what that basically means is you're borrowing so much that you cannot pay. You can barely pay the interest on the loan as opposed to paying back the loan. Now, if you cannot afford the interest on the loan to build a road, how are you going to afford the interest on the loan to, I don't know, build a solar plant or something along those lines, right? So the debt conversation continues to be very important. I mean, just coming into this year, I think either Ethiopia or Ghana, I forget which country it is now, is about to default on debt, right? So again, this debt conversation coming out of last year, is very important as we move forward. There are several policy proposals in the air about how to fix that, but, that's a conversation. The fourth thing, which goes back to China, is, and I think we often forget this, everyone's so used to the China growth miracle. We forget that China is actually struggling economically right now. For the longest time, everyone talks about the China growth miracle. China brought out, millions of people out of poverty. China's economy, GDP has been growing at a rate of 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever percent. The truth is, coming out of COVID, China is not doing well. A lot of local Chinese banks are struggling internally with their own debt issues, right? Like China itself is in an economic, I don't want to say nightmare because I don't want to be quoted as saying nightmare, but it's not good, my people. And so there's that conversation that needs to be had about, if you cannot take care of your domestic economy, to what extent can you lend us in Kenya, in Nigeria, and South Africa more money to do the things that we want to do? So there's that conversation. So again, I'm just counting the BRI turning 10, Africa's voting at the UN, and the debt conversations in Africa, China's very own economic issues. And then the fifth one, which I think, again, if you're in the climate change space, you probably spent all of last year talking about this, is the issue around critical minerals. If I had $1 for every time I said the word critical mineral, the phrase critical minerals last year, honestly, I would just, I'd be on holiday with Jeff Bezos at this point. But critical minerals, I think that discourse is going to continue, right? Critical minerals, think of it as what we need to build electric vehicles, what we need to sort of set up solar panels. It's what goes into the energy transition to oversimplify what critical minerals are. And, the countries that have the highest deposits of critical minerals are the DRC, Namibia, Nigeria, African countries, right? And so there's a conversation happening on two fronts. One is, how do African countries use these critical minerals to grow themselves? One. But two is also, again, we come back to this sort of US-China dynamic where there's that global competition. A lot of the conversation last year was about how the US and China are competing for critical minerals in Africa. And, again, that conversation annoys me because it's like, there's so much more to this conversation. It's like we cannot always be talking about the competition for Africa. It has to be Africa taking ownership of the conversation. And, what happened last year was you saw the DRC, President Felix of the DRC, really criticizing some of the deals his predecessor had done for critical minerals with China and trying to renegotiate or sort of calibrate some of the existing contracts, right? So again, that conversation will continue into 2024. Critical minerals, I think, if we're going to keep talking about the energy transition or we're going to keep talking about climate change in the way we're talking about it, critical minerals is so, so important. The last two things, the BRICS expansion. I think this one, and I think this is very much my personal opinion. This is not, this does not reflect any research or anything. This is just a theory working out of my head, is the BRICS expansion. So before the BRICS was Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And what happens coming out of August 2023 is Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Argentina, the UAE, and Ethiopia were admitted to join the BRICS. Now, at the time, this was such an amazing thing because the BRICS in itself is starting to seem like a counter to the unilateralism of the United States, right? Like it's a new group of global South, if that makes sense. But what has immediately become clear is the non-binding nature of the BRICS. What I mean by that is Argentina elects the most interesting president as far as I'm concerned. And immediately it's clear that Argentina will no longer join the BRICS, right? And so you start to see the effect of domestic politics on international relations, right? So there's the BRICS expansion, which, to be honest, we can all sit here as policy experts and as academics to say, this is what we think will happen. But the truth is we will not know anything until Russia hosts the next BRICS meeting and we see who actually shows up from the additional countries. And then finally, the last thing, which I think has not gotten as much press as I think it should, is the fact that the African Union is now part of the G20. And I think from a climate perspective, that is getting a seat at the table because oftentimes the climate conversation is a function of who was in the room when they were sharing the money. Right? Like who was there when if there's 100 billion, who was there when they were sharing 100 billion, right? And the African Union joining the G20, to the extent that it is, it doesn't give power like, the US has power in the G20, but it is a seat at the table. It is a sort of inclusion, and it is I forget how the sort of official language around what it is. But the point is, when a G20 meeting happens, the African Union, by proxy Africa, is now represented at the G20. And I think we need to pay more attention to that because you start to look at what does that mean for the coups that have happened in Gabon, in Niger. You start to ask yourself, what is that involvement? How does Africa craft its own narrative within this very, very powerful institution? So that's sort of last year. The last thing I'll just add on this is looking very specifically at what are we talking about this year? So all these issues that I mentioned from last year, follow us into 2024. But in 2024, the elephant in the room is very much FOCAC. And I always like to talk about the evolution of FOCAC. So you have the first FOCAC where I think almost $60 billion is pledged, right, by President Xi. And that is, I like to call that the infrastructure FOCAC. right? It's the FOCAC where we all say, China is giving us money, we're going to build all these roads, we're going to build all these dams, all these infrastructure projects. But then we move into the next major FOCAC, and again, we sort of move into a climate FOCAC. It's the smallest, beautiful FOCAC, right? It's like, we're not building massive roads, we're not building, massive projects. We're going to take tiny projects, build them well, make them environmentally friendly. So, you sort of come to that second FOCAC. And now we come into this third FOCAC, and I suspect, and this is very much my, this is not something that has been researched, but it's a theory I'm working with, is this FOCAC is going to be the accountability FOCAC. So this is the FOCAC where everybody comes to the table and we say, these are all the promises we made since 2018. What exactly have we done? And should we keep doing this? That is my theory for what this FOCAC is going to be. Obviously, I'm not President Xi, so I do not set the agenda, but that is sort of the thing that I'm working on. And from a climate perspective, I think that is what we need, right? In the China-Africa relationship, we make all these promises, billions and billions of dollars are promised every year, but what is actually achieved? What is done? So I think, just to sort of close my talk is, coming out of 2024, there's a lot of geopolitical issues, but as we enter coming out of 2023, there's a lot of geopolitical issues, but as we step into 2024, I think there's potential for FOCAC to be a pause, reassess button, and then we start to move from there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Fikeri, I think you were very concise, giving us a rundown of the previous, 2023, what happened and what is expected of Africa-China relations as a climate cooperation in 2024. When you mentioned about the 10 BRI, I think it was a major activity, and some of us, we had the opportunity to be there, and the conversation really was all about climate and environmental sustainability, and some of the major announcements from China about the sort of programs and the kind of infusion that they have in the new project and the BRI, smart, sustainable project that they're focusing on. So I think that was a very key part of the conversation. I like the fact that you mentioned about the FOCAC of 2024, that hopefully is going to be a FOCAC of accountability, where parties will get to track what has been some of the key pillars and what has the implementation been and all of that. We're hoping that as a center, we'll be able to also be involved in producing some of the insights regarding that. So we'll be getting some updates from the ACCPA with respect to what is expected to unfold in FOCAC 2024. And even post-FOCAC, we'll still be bringing you some updates on that. We'll be going deeper into some of the questions that have already been raised. I'll start with Professor 𝐀𝐤𝐤𝐿. I think there's a question from one of our friends, Nikolai, as I really work with him for the BRI forum. I'm sure, Prof, you remember your friend. So he's asking, how do you think Africa will or should navigate the growing US-China competition? Europe is currently siding with Washington and wonder whether Africa is able and to what extent to chart a middle way between the two. So, Papa, I think you briefly touch on that. So if you can just give your brief thought on this question from Nicola. Yeah.
There's so much happening. I think the problem or challenge that Africa faces is that it is always seen through the lenses from the past, particularly Europe. And there's this ownership that comes with most people, that they look at Africa in a way that it should not have an independent agency, that my colleague has eloquently put it. But the competition will continue. There will be areas. I do not think the competition between RSS and United States-led Western world, I mean, that includes Europe, will be as hot as in the Cold War era, United States and Soviet Union. Given the strength of the Chinese economy and the link with the US, I mean, those economies are intertwined. I mean, it's really hard to de-link or de-risking. I mean, it would be really hard to do that, particularly on the African continent. You can't, for instance, uproot Huawei's infrastructure, whether in Ghana, in Nigeria, or here in South Africa, where it controls 80, 90% of telecom. So we're going to see a lot of challenges coming. But I think we're too focused on just China. We're focused on Europe and United States. There's something that is happening quietly. I don't know if colleagues, you following what's happening in Yemen. Ships are no longer going the Nile, and they're coming via the Cape now because of the Houthis, and so many things is happening. My prediction is that the next 5 years, 10 years, please, I beg, watch Saudis. The big next news is coming from the Saudis, whether you like them or not, with all the perceptions people have of Saudis. They are coming up big. Therefore, when we look at models to follow, we mustn't limit ourselves to, we need to see what the Gulf states are doing. I was in Qatar recently. I think the Saudis are playing the global South game much better, and the Qatarians and UAEs. I mean, I think they've realized the power that they have and the importance of BRICS, closer to United States on one hand. I think my point here is that they are playing a better game between these competing powers, of which we are not. We tend to be either you are pro the West and crazy so, regardless of all the negative stuff that the West is doing on the West, or you're pro China in a very crazy way. I think we need to balance our views and really play the game. What is Africa's interest? Africa needs to rise as a pillar in itself. And yeah, of course, we have much more closer friends than others, and also rank them, these external actors. Should 10, 20 telephone calls comes at the same time at the AU, which one should we pick first? Do we pick South Korea? Do we pick some of these really small and I mean irrelevant powers who call our head of state? They fly in, they love flying, they all fly to those capitals. I think we need to do ranking. I think we need to do much more research, perhaps jointly, and see all these actors and really have a nice chart to see who has much more power, who in dollar and cents, I mean, who has really impact in terms of training Africans in what areas. I'm not religious. I mean, my name is David, so you can say I'm anti-Christianity. I am. But too many reverends and we have on the continent. I think we need more hardcore skills relevant to the digital world we're entering. And that I think we need to measure infrastructure and the like. But the debt that the Chinese are being, it's so early to say there's such thing as debt trap. If you follow literature, you really, those who are really studying, you can't find even the relevance of the term debt trap. You really can't. There isn't any really serious work out there. I think it falls within propaganda more so, but that does not mean Africa does not have debt. And we are also going through a crisis, the global financial crisis of 2008. We're going through COVID, we're going through a number of factors that with or without China, Africa will be still in a serious debt issues. It happened in the 70s and the early 80s, leading up to the Berg report, World Bank. And therefore, the issue of debt and debt crisis is nothing new. But I think what we really need to do is to really train our people in negotiating. We really need to strengthen our states so that we have skilled people who enter into understanding some of these complex issues. We need to be very serious with the Africa Free Trade offices and Secretariat in particular. I get annoyed to see that even our own or Secretariat people at times get trained by donor money. You cannot receive money on key areas. to keep your own security, to build people who are going to negotiate with the very same people who are giving you money. It makes no sense. I really don't understand why the AU allows. I mean, you really need security vetting. You need a number of things so that people who negotiate on behalf of the continent are beyond any reproach, are not given money, are not being flown anywhere to receive any form of education or research money on anything. I think this should be Africa-led, Africa-funded, if we are really serious of negotiating with China and the United States, European Union, as a pillar in itself. So I think there's so much unfair on China and the lessons of Zambia, and more is coming. Nepal and other countries or Sri Lanka, which is a darling on these issues. You follow it, Sri Lanka, with the crisis in Sri Lanka, we saw that Japan has more debt than China in that country, or in the European countries. And therefore, I think China does not belong to OECD. It does not follow the norms and values of the Western world. And therefore, it tends to be judged at times unfairly, I must say. But that does not mean we don't have issues with China. We need to look into those things and negotiate as Africans from a position of strength.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
No, I think,
yes, you're coming. Yeah, Fikayo.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to touch on what Prof said, because I think we're completely aligned. I'm one of those people that once somebody starts saying China is doing blah 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 in Africa, you've lost me in that conversation. I think there needs to be a focus on African agency, and I think more than ever, Africans like us need to start pushing that conversation. And I think I want to touch back on what Prof said around the debt conversation, right? Because debt in itself is not a bad thing. Germany has so much debt. Japan has so much debt. During there was a conference in Paris last year in July, and the Prime Minister of Barbados actually talked about the fact that Germany, Japan, the UK, the US have so much debt. But the issue when it comes to sort of African countries is the question of what exactly is this debt being used for, right? Like what is coming out of the debt? If you borrow, $300 billion and you build so many roads, you build so many dams, there's economic growth, then by all means, take as much of it as you can. But if you get that money and it's not quite clear what that money has gone for, then that is a problem. And I think someone from Development Reimagined is on this call, and Development Reimagined has a wonderful policy paper where they talk about one of the ways to solve the debt crisis. And in that paper, they talk about creating a borrowers club, right? So for those who follow the debt conversation, there's the Paris Club, which is effectively a creditors club, right? Like all the creditors of African countries of most countries banding together, and they negotiate as the Paris Club together. But there is no debtors club, right? So if I'm Nigeria, I want to negotiate with my creditors, I have to come as Nigeria. If I'm Ethiopia, I have to come as Ethiopia. If I'm Ghana, I have to come. And, at some point, it's diverging interests, right? So there's this paper, and again, I wish I could find it. I should have looked it up before I started speaking, but Development Reimagined has that wonderful paper, which I do think everyone should read, because it talks about the idea of creating a borrowers club. And I think if Africa under the AU or whatever sort of institution we choose can work together and say, look, this is how we will negotiate, or this is how we will push for debt restructuring, debt, forgiveness, whatever, it brings power to the coalition, right? The EU doesn't negotiate as 26 different countries. The EU negotiates as a bloc. And I think we're getting to that point where either through the free trade agreements, through the AU, ECOWAS, whatever institution we're choosing, there's that need, I think, for African countries to really pull together and be clear. What is the message? Because I think everybody can agree. I say it's an African proverb. If until the day the lion learns to speak, the hunter will always tell the story. That's what we're seeing right now, right? If we don't take ownership of the narrative, everyone's gonna keep coming out saying, this is what China is doing in Africa. And I do think, I think someone from Development Reimagined has shared the report, so it's worth having it. I'm not paid by DR, by the way. I just love the report. Just FYI. I should just say that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yes, Prof, you wanted to come in?
Yes, very quickly on G20. I think I'm one of those who are very skeptical, I must say. having Africans sitting in that room, it's mainly for photo shoots anyway. I do not see any impact. But I'm of the view that Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya should be there. And the AU, if you have that situation, look at Europe, for instance. You have the EU there. You have Italy or Germany or France, and all these countries are there. And they have an impact. At the moment of just having South Africa and the AU, really, I do not think the AU part, it should be really, yeah, of course, we welcome, it's something, but that move carries no weight. I think you had a number of countries, Canada and everyone else claiming, even India, that the Western world seemed to push India to be the champion of global South instead of China. Everyone speaking on behalf of Africa in a way, in a very patronizing in most instance. So I think we really need powers there. And when I say powers, I mean countries that speak, that implement policies. AU does not implement anything. They do talk, they go, they fly in. And I don't know whether some of this small island and is chair of the AU and goes on behalf of Africa. I mean, coming back, I know it's supposed to give reports and discussions at AU, but I really do not see an impact. As a matter of fact, at times is the buy-in that particularly the United States is playing these days, that we have Africans. I mean, you buzz them in to White House and you say, look, the Africans are here, but nothing really happens and they don't take you quite serious. Last year, is it last year or the year before, they buzzed Africans into White House, photo shoots, and Biden say, I'm coming to your continent in 2023. Did he come? I don't know.
The vice president. I think it was the vice president.
Yeah, but he never came. I mean, in the end, even under when he went into power, he promised that he would be in Africa in 2023. He never came. So I mean, I really do not think if Africa is taken that serious, other than just let's have them, let's keep them talking. So I think we need to have powers there, and I don't understand why Nigeria is not a member of BRICS. I don't know what's happening in Lagos, not being a member.
I have a theory.
I have a theory. Anyway, let me end there. I think we need really serious players than AU.
Yeah. Fika, so before you come in on the Nigeria thing, so I just wanted to tie in on again on the climate thing. Of course, we all know that China has been the biggest or largest investor when it comes to Africa's infrastructure development. You understand the implication of infrastructure development and environment in that respect. So I just wanted to know what has been the outcome, the few outcomes in terms of infrastructure development and climate-related activities in the country. We have give or take 10 minutes to wrap up. So maybe you can give.
Yeah, no, thank you. To be fair, I'll keep my theory on why Nigeria is not in BRICS to myself, because the last time I shared it, they were not happy. I think I'm trying to stay on the straight and narrow in 2024. So I will say, as far as like some of the outcomes from China, so China has refused. So I mentioned earlier the Loss and Damage Fund, right? China has refused to donate to the Loss and Damage Fund because China continues to insist it's a developing country, so it shouldn't be forced to invest in the Loss and Damage Fund. But what the data shows is that one of the biggest sort of climate funders in Africa is China. And what you're finding is China, more than any other sort of great power, in quotes, is investing in dams, hydroelectric dams, is investing in solar farms, is investing in what are effectively clean, renewable energy products. So historically, there has been that sort of Chinese investment causing, or at least sort of affecting the environment negatively. But what we are seeing now is, for example, China has, I think a couple of years ago, 2022, the President Xi said China would no longer build coal plants abroad. Now, there's been some sort of argument about whether that means no more new plants commissioned or no more new plants built, because those are two different things. But what you are finding, as far as Africa is concerned, is there has been that shift and that increase in renewable investments in South Africa now. Sorry, in Nigeria now, the majority of Chinese energy sector investments, I think, comes from hydropower. I think there's also that sort of shift you're starting to see in South Africa, in Kenya, and Angola. I think Angola is the only one where you don't sort of see that difference immediately, but you start to see that movement. So I think one of the outcomes that has come out is that shift in investment, right? And the good thing about that as well is the fact that these projects, because they are smaller and sort of less expensive, if that makes sense, tend to have a better completion rate, right? It's like oftentimes you find roads being built and at some point they're abandoned, whereas most of these hydro projects have actually gone on to be quite successful. So I think to the extent that China has, at least my working theory, and again, I realize this is being recorded, so I just want to say this is the working theory. There's no data sort of backing this up that I can provide yet, but my working theory is, as of today, there's almost a net zero impact on the environment. Whatever damage has been caused by building roads, infrastructure, and all these other things is now being sort of netted out by these investments in climate change, in climate-friendly projects, hydropower dams, and even what China is doing now that I think no other major power has caught on to is investing in technical know-how. So investing in actually educating Africans on, okay, this is what climate change looks like. This is how you should fight it. This is what you need to be doing. This is how you need to be doing it in a more sort of grassroots way that I don't think the US or the EU or Brazil or any other major power really has done. Is the Chinese are actually coming into, I mean, my experience of Nigeria at Christmas was there's certain parts of Lagos where there are actual Chinese manufacturers installing solar panels in people's houses in Lagos, Nigeria, right? That's not something any other power has caught on to. So I think, there's the net positive of what the actual major investments are, but there's also this sort of grassroots thing where there's that push towards, encouraging solar panel use in individual homes and recycling in Nigeria.
Okay. Thank you very much, 𝐾𝐤𝐤, for that update. I'll come back with your last comments. So, Prof, there's a question here that I think relates to the earlier submission that you made. This is from Meike. So the person asking, do you observe a convergence of interests or potentials regarding industrial cooperation between China and African countries, example, in the field of critical minerals and related productive links, suggesting a shift in investment focus away from infrastructure? So it says, asking specifically, do you see any interest or convergence between Africa and China in terms of industrial cooperation? And if there has been any shifts, so far that we observed within that period. And there's a question that I will just add it up to make it. So the question was whether you think the current state in terms of Africa-China relation is the best. Do you think we have the best kind of relation with China now as a continent, or you share a different opinion on that? So just these two. And then maybe you can add your closing remarks as well before I take that.
Sure. Whether the relationship is best in what? I think relations, all relations, it depends in what area of the relationship. There are a number of areas where the relationship, firstly, at a high level political, I think the relationship is at its very best. Our heads of state, they pick up a telephone to President Xi, they go, we see them in Beijing, and with fairness, we quite often see President Xi Jinping on the African continent. He does visit. And compared to others, I think he has done extremely well, and our heads of states are also frequently visiting. I think they visit Beijing more than the United Nations headquarters, some. And therefore, it's best in that sense. When it comes to economy, I think investments, there are challenges, that teething problems. That the lack of capacity on the African continent, it's a major challenge. The lack of coordination. We've done research in East Africa, for instance. You see one country, Kenya, for instance, done extremely well in bringing in Chinese on rail, while Uganda, for instance, negotiate with China and not agree. So the rail that the Chinese are building in Kenya does not link up with the Ugandan, which in our own Africa agenda, we need these networks, the bottlenecks, to be opened up to strengthen regional integration. So at times, it's not just China, quite a number of others. Lack of coordination, fragmentation. You see external actors appear to be leading in some of our nation states, and therefore the more it needs to be done. I think the relationship could improve in certain technical areas. We have the coastal, the blue economy, for instance. I mean, our own deep waters is unexplored, actually. We have a lot of external players on the African continent, literally stealing African fish, minerals, and quite a number of things that we have. We have no control. We don't know who is coming in, who's going out. We don't have eyes in terms of satellites, nor do we have formidable navy to really police some of these ships that are really sweeping the sea, ocean on the African continent. So there's so much that could be done in terms of Africa getting organized, work with China, work with others to strengthen the capacity at the African continent. And the relationship, I think, going forward in the area of digital in its core, I think more needs to be done. The world is entering the fourth industrial revolution. We do talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution on the African continent, but as usual, we tend to do fourth industrial revolution through declarations than really doing. While the Chinese they talk less and they show you exactly what they're doing. I think we need to start rudimental. Let's clean up our borders. Let's build infrastructure. Let's stop these tiny flags all over the place making noise, and open up, allow our people to move and trade among ourselves more, and engage China in a meaningful way through the free trade, and really hard on Chinese so that they give in on some of our core interests. A lot of African students going to China. Please, we need them to deal with issues of space and e-commerce and other areas that are really core to our needs, and we need to build that infrastructure on the African continent. The algorithm and all other issues about fourth industrial revolution, ChatGPT, I really don't know if there's any African in it. Even facial recognition, we really need language. We're left out. We're literally left out. I normally make jokes that should be anything happen and we have to abandon planet Earth, Africans will be left behind. We don't have any satellite, any space, anything that goes up there and stay there for a year. So we really need to strengthen our universities, our think tanks, and research much more harder from an African perspective than just follow the money. Most of our NGOs and research centers, they tend to follow money to hear exactly what the Chinese wants to hear what the Westerners want to hear and deliver because they're following the money. Well, I think we need to understand what we need to do and be frank with our friends, whether they're Chinese or Americans, in terms of our needs. Thank you.
Thank you. You got your last comments and then we can wrap up here.
Yes, I mean, this has been so amazing. I think Prof, everywhere I go now, I should just be quoting Prof because everything that has been said, I think, we're on the same page about. I think what I will just say is 2024 is going to be an exciting year. Regardless of how you follow, China, Africa, whether it's through climate change, digital innovation, geopolitics, whatever, I think it's going to be a very interesting year. And I think the key, if you know, there's any African policymakers listening, is really figuring out what the Africa angle is and pushing it, right? Everybody has their angle. Israel wants weapons. Everybody wants what they want. And I do think there needs to be, and you know, that's acknowledging that Africa is not a monolith, right? Like what Nigeria wants is not what, I don't know, Ghana wants. But we do, as African countries, need to figure out what exactly it is we want, and start to get serious about asking those things, because I think it's time we move past this whole other countries are doing this to us, right? So we have agency, and you know, now more than ever is the time to exercise that agency.
Thank you very much. So we very much, first of all, I would like to thank all our panelists, Fikayo, David, and Nancy, who left earlier because she has a national assignment. And to all of you that joined us, we had quite a number that stayed with us from the beginning to the end. We are so much grateful. This session has been recorded, so we're going to just prepare it well and put it on our YouTube channel. We will share it via email, and also you can follow our social media handles, Africa China Center for Policy and Advisory, to get updates in terms of the recording that came out from this session. Once again, thank you for joining us. This has been brought to you by the Africa China Center for Policy and Advisory. You can actually visit our website. I think I'll put a link there. And of course, you join us, so obviously you'll be getting emails from us. You can read more on our website, some of the updates that we put in there. This is not going to be the last for the year. We're going to come up with a lot of other such discussion. Of course, virtually is by convenience, so you can join us from anywhere. So thank you for joining us, and come your way again soon. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.